before the blade touched her neck, and Boleyn endured something far worse: silence. No trial that mattered, no husband to defend her, just whispered betrayals and an executioner summoned from France, for a queen who was never meant to kneel. In the spring of 1536, Anne Boleyn stood at the center of England's most powerful court as queen. Yet her throne had already begun to rot beneath her. To the world, she was still the wife of Henry VIII, crowned, titled, and draped in the velvet of queenship, but behind the heavy doors of court, whispers sharpened into knives. The same voices that once hailed her as savior of the Tudor line were now rehearsing her downfall. Her crime had no body count. No war had been waged, no crown stolen. She had broken no law that existed in writing, but her greatest sin was political. She had failed to give Henry a living son. The boy she birthed was stillborn. The pregnancies that followed either ended in miscarriage or silence, and the only child to survive Elizabeth was a daughter. Brilliant, yes, but female, and in Henry's eyes, unforgivable. To understand the scale of what would unfold, one must understand that Anne Boleyn had not merely been a queen. She had been a revolution. Henry had torn England from the Catholic Church for her. He had disgraced his first wife, banished her daughter Mary, and waged theological war to justify a love that had now cooled into disgust. The entire kingdom had shifted for Anne, and when she no longer served its king's purpose, that shift became a fault line. By April, the air around her had turned cold. Courtiers no longer bowed with conviction. The ladies in waiting shared fewer words, and the king, once infatuated to the point of obsession, avoided her gaze entirely. Anne's most loyal allies sensed the change, but could do little. Her enemies, however, moved quickly. Chief among them, Thomas Cromwell, the king's master secretary, a man who once supported her rise, but now saw her as a liability to be erased. The plan was simple in its cruelty. They would accuse the queen of adultery, incest, and treason. Crimes so monstrous they didn't require proof, just belief. Rumors became testimonies. Smirks became confessions. And the men closest to her, musicians, poets, even her own brother, were named as co-conspirators. It was absurd, but in a world where the king's displeasure was law, absurdity was power. Anne's arrest on May 2nd came without ceremony. She was summoned under the pretense of inquiry and never returned. The queen was escorted from Greenwich Palace to the Tower of London by barge, the same river route she had taken during her coronation 3 years earlier. Then, the crowds had cheered. Now, silence followed her like a funeral procession. She entered the Tower not as a monarch, but as a traitor, though no formal charges had been read aloud. The walls that once kept England's enemies out would now hold its most infamous queen in. Her chambers were cold, stripped of royal comfort, and attended by strangers. Every step she took echoed louder than the last, and knew she was being watched, and worse, she was being listened to, for a woman who had once commanded kings. This was the beginning of her unraveling. Her intelligence, her wit, her fire, none of it could save her now. She asked to see the king. She begged for a fair hearing. She even clutched a prayer book, whispering psalms between shivering breaths. But the answer she received was silence. Not from God, but from Henry. And it was that silence, louder than any accusation, that told her she would not leave the Tower alive. What Anne didn't yet know was that the stage was already set, not just for her death, but for a performance so brutal, so deliberately orchestrated, that her final days would redefine the meaning of royal betrayal. Next came the architects of her destruction, and they were not strangers. The court of Henry VIII in 1536 was not merely a place of governance, it was a theater of survival. Each gesture, each glance, each whisper carried consequences, and at its center stood a monarch whose whims had the power to sanctify or destroy. By the time Anne Boleyn entered the Tower, the world outside had already decided her fate. It was not justice that demanded her death, it was preservation. Henry's court had become a battlefield of factions. The conservative allies of Queen Catherine, long humiliated by Anne's rise, now found their vengeance within reach. Thomas Cromwell, once Anne's greatest political weapon, had turned against her with quiet precision. His motivations were layered: to preserve his standing, to appease foreign allies, and perhaps, most dangerously, to please a king who no longer needed the woman he once bled the nation to possess. England was shifting. The Reformation that Anne had championed now threatened to spin out of control. With her fall, the king could recalibrate, reassert control, and pursue a more politically expedient marriage. And lurking in the background was Jane Seymour, the silent figure of obedience and fertility, everything and had proven not to be. The legal groundwork for Anne's execution had already been laid in the form of acts of treason, broad laws that made thought itself a punishable offense. A queen could now be guilty not only for what she did, but for what others imagined she had done. Her failure to produce a male heir was no longer just a disappointment, it could now be construed as sabotage. The men named in her affairs were drawn from those closest to her: Mark Smeaton, a court musician; Sir Henry Norris, a trusted courtier; even George Boleyn, her own brother. Cromwell ensured that each man would be interrogated separately, under conditions that stripped away all dignity. Smeaton, tortured into confession, became the linchpin of the case. His admission, whether real or fabricated, opened the floodgates for further accusations. Once one domino fell, the rest were positioned to collapse in sequence. To the public, little was known beyond what the court allowed to seep out, but that was by design. Cromwell understood that spectacle required mystery, and nothing fanned flames of suspicion like royal silence. The Queen's image began to shift in the public imagination from reformer to seductress, from martyr to manipulator. Anne's enemies understood the symbolism at play. She had not merely seduced a king, she had changed the very soul of England. Her fall needed to be more than legal, it had to be spiritual. They crafted a narrative that painted her as a witch, a corrupter, an incestuous serpent slithering through the sanctity of the Tudor bloodline. It was grotesque and effective. Inside the Tower, Anne felt this transformation taking place. Letters from allies grew cold. Servants avoided her eyes. The guards, once deferential, became indifferent. She remained defiant, but the isolation began to cut deeper than any accusation. She knew that the court she once commanded was now using its full machinery to erase her from memory before her body was even cold. Outside, the nobility watched with nervous anticipation. If a queen could fall like this so suddenly, so violently, then no one was safe. The rules had changed. Power was no longer a shield, it was a target. And as the list of supposed lovers grew, as the indictments stacked, and as the scaffold took shape in the distance, one truth became impossible to ignore. The machine that once lifted Anne Boleyn to glory had been repurposed to grind her into dust. But even in that dust, there remained a voice, and Anne would use it in the Tower, in the courtroom, and on the scaffold until they silenced her for good. Before she was a queen, Anne Boleyn was a girl, brilliant, sharp-tongued, and dangerous only in the way intelligence becomes threatening in a woman. Born around 1501 to Thomas Boleyn and Lady Elizabeth Howard, Anne's lineage placed her on the fringes of nobility, but it was her mind, not her birth, that would chart her rise. She was educated in the courts of the Netherlands and France, where she absorbed not only languages and etiquette, but ideas dangerous, reformist, and modern. She returned to England with a charisma that could not be ignored. Unlike the soft-spoken, demure women of Henry's court, and dazzled, she debated, she read philosophy, she wore French gowns and refused to bow when silence was expected. Even her enemies could not deny her magnetism, and when Henry VIII noticed her, it was not as a mistress but as a storm he could not contain. At first, and refused him. She would not be a concubine like her sister Mary, who had already warmed the king's bed. If Henry wanted her, he would have to change the world for her, and he did. Years of legal and religious upheaval followed. The king broke from Rome. He defied the Pope. He built a new church just to crown her queen. But revolutions carry debt, and Anne's debt came in the form of expectation. She had to be worth it. She had to produce a son. Anne's marriage to Henry in 1533 should have been her triumph. Yet from the moment Elizabeth was born, the clock began to tick. The king's obsession with a male heir darkened into quiet resentment. Each failed pregnancy chipped away at Anne's power. Where once he had written her letters dripping with love, now he wrote none at all. Whispers began again at court, not of her glory, but of her inadequacy. Still, Anne was not passive. She defended her interests. She argued theology with bishops. She tried to place reformist scholars into the king's inner circle. But each assertion of her will was viewed as arrogance. Where Catherine of Aragon had suffered in silence and fought back, and every fight made her more vulnerable. Among her closest allies was her brother, George Boleyn, a poetic and confident courtier who shared Anne's reformist zeal. Their bond was strong, unshakable, and for that very reason, it would later be twisted into something grotesque. Then there was Mark Smeaton, a talented musician who performed at court and admired him from afar. Their interactions were brief, but even the smallest association could become deadly when ambition and jealousy mingled with royal paranoia. Sir Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton, names that meant little outside court would soon become bound to Anne. In infamy, but in these years, and still, believed she was untouchable. She had risked everything and emerged as queen. She had enemies, yes, but she was the mother of the king's child. She was his second wife. She had reshaped England. That had to mean something. What she couldn't see was how fragile her empire had become. Every friendship was now a liability, every glance a weapon, and every man near her, no matter how innocent, was a future corpse in waiting. Yet Anne continued as though her crown was secure. She hosted banquets. She attended mass. She wrote letters to reformers abroad. Her pride, the same force that had carried her through the chaos of Henry's court, now blinded her to the fact that the stage was being set behind her back. And when the first arrests came, when the king's gaze turned cold and foreign, and finally realized that the life she had built was not a monument, it was a trap. But by then, her fate was no longer in her hands. It was in the hands of the men who once knelt before her and now sharpened their knives behind closed doors. The first sign came not with a scream, but a silence. One by one, the men in Anne's orbit began to vanish. Mark Smeaton, the court musician, disappeared without explanation. Next was Sir Henry Norris, then William Brereton, Francis Weston, all of them accused of one unthinkable crime, sharing the Queen's bed. But no one had seen the evidence. There were no witnesses, only whispers, sanctioned by power and carved into law by men who feared losing their place beside the king. It was Thomas Cromwell who orchestrated the choreography. A master of legal manipulation, he assembled a case not to uncover truth, but to construct it. Torture was not officially permitted in England, but Cromwell knew how to apply pressure. He had Smeaton imprisoned and isolated, stripped of dignity, hope, and air until he confessed. Whether what he confessed to ever happened didn't matter. His words were enough to set the wheels in motion. Smeaton named names, whether willingly or as a final act of survival. That was all the court needed. One confession to stain them all. The Queen's name was next, dragged into the accusations, like a corpse hauled into daylight. But unlike the others, Anne did not go quietly. When confronted, she denied every charge with the ferocity of someone who had built kingdoms out of defiance. She was brought before a privy council under the guise of formal questioning. But the room was not built for justice, it was built for confirmation, and held her composure, demanding to know the specifics of the accusations. But none were given. Instead, vague mentions of flirtations and laughter, of court dances and sideways glances, were treated as treasonous. Her voice echoed in a chamber already deaf to truth. Even worse, Cromwell accused her of incest with her brother George, Lord Rochford. The charge was so perverse, so vile, it stunned even Anne. Her bond with George, intellectual, emotional, deeply loyal, had been transformed into sin by those who knew nothing of their love, only the threat it posed. George was arrested. The same day when Anne was told, she did not cry, she did not scream. She simply closed her eyes and said, "None but God can judge us." Inside the tower, Anne's world narrowed to stone walls and listening ears. Her ladies in waiting were chosen not for comfort, but for surveillance. Every word she spoke, every prayer, every restless movement during the night was reported back to Cromwell and the king, and began to feel madness creeping in. One moment she wept uncontrollably. The next she laughed at the absurdity of the accusations. The court would later twist those laughs into proof of guilt, calling them the cackles of a witch outside. The mood at court shifted from disbelief to quiet acceptance. Few dared speak her name aloud, Those who had once basked in her favor now bowed to Jane Seymour, who lingered near Henry like a shadow promising peace. The king, once insatiable in his love for Anne, refused to see her. He rode through the countryside, hunting, feasting, pretending to be at ease while his wife rotted within the tower he had once given her as a gift. And supporters were powerless. Even Archbishop Cranmer, who had crowned her, now hesitated. Parliament was prepared to move quickly. A queen accused of adultery threatened the legitimacy of the royal succession. The longer she lived, the more unstable the realm became. So they told themselves, in truth, it was not the country's future they feared, it was her memory. Because memory, unlike bodies, could not be buried. And the court was preparing something far worse than a trial. It was preparing a spectacle. A public dismantling not only of Anne Boleyn's innocence, but of her existence. On May 15, 1536, Anne Boleyn was led from the Tower to the great hall, within its walls a courtroom draped in ceremony but hallowed of justice. The air was thick with theater. Peers of the realm lined the benches, and among them sat her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, chosen to preside as Lord High Steward. His face was carved from stone, his voice steady, but it was no secret. He had come to condemn his own blood, and stood in her regal bearing, dressed in black velvet and wearing a headdress that framed her pale, proud face. She looked not like a fallen woman, but like a queen wronged. When the charges were read aloud, adultery with 5 men, incest with her brother, conspiracy to kill the king, there was no gasp, just silence. A silence so total it became a kind of verdict all its own. The case was a tapestry of falsehoods, stitched together with forced confessions and imaginative timelines. Some of the alleged affairs occurred when Anne was pregnant, confined to bed and guarded constantly. Other encounters supposedly happened on days when she and the accused were in different cities. The inconsistencies were glaring, but no one in the hall came to question them. They came to confirm the king's will and defended herself with fierce clarity. She questioned dates. She denied the charges with unwavering calm. When accused of laughing with Norris about the king's death, she said, "I never wished him dead. I only wished him a better heart." Her words hung in the air like incense, beautiful, but ignored. For every rational defense, there was a wall of power arrayed against her, ready to dismiss truth in favor of obedience. George Boleyn was tried the same day, facing the incest charge with the same poise that Anne displayed. When a poem he had written was used as evidence of forbidden affection, he smirked and said, "Then every writer in England must be guilty." But irony, like innocence, had no place in the courtroom that day. The verdicts were swift, guilty of all charges, for all accused, and was sentenced to be burned or beheaded. At the king's discretion, George and the others would be hanged, drawn, and quartered. The weight of these words did not fall softly, and did not break. When asked if she had anything to say, she replied, "I am the king's true wife, and none can prove otherwise." The trial ended as it had begun, with the outcome already known. The court dissolved into murmurs, nobles pretending solemnity, knowing they had just murdered a queen in everything but name, and was escorted back to her cell, where the walls now seemed tighter, the shadows heavier. She knew now that the law had never been hers to appeal to. It had always belonged to the man who had once promised her eternity. News of the trial spread across Europe with lightning speed. Foreign ambassadors wrote home in stunned disbelief. Even the Pope, long at odds with Henry, expressed quiet horror at the proceedings. But within England, a new silence settled. It was the hush that follows a storm, the moment before the final blow falls, and waited, not for pardon, not for rescue, but for the king's decision, flames or sword. Each are stretched endlessly, her fate balanced between two forms of death. Either way, her story would end in public agony. But Henry had one more humiliation planned, a gesture so precise, so chilling, that it would strip Anne of not just her life, but her dignity. And Boleyn was still alive, but the process of erasing her had already begun. On May 17th, from the windows of her cell in the Tower, she heard the muffled drums and distant cries as the 5 men accused with her were led to their executions. Her brother George was among them. The queen, once crowned with splendor, was now made to listen as the scaffold was baptized in blood. Before her own feet touched its boards, They had chosen beheading instead of burning, a mercy. They said granted by Henry, but a knew better. It wasn't mercy, it was calculation. Burning a queen would stain history. Beheading her, however, could be framed as justice, royal justice, swift, clean, controlled. Yet the method was not the only message. What mattered more was who would deliver the blow. Henry summoned an executioner from Calais, a man famed for his precision with a sword instead of an axe. The decision was strategic. The sword was foreign, silent, elegant. Unlike the axe, which often required multiple blows, the sword could sever with one. It was a gesture meant to preserve the king's image, killing his wife not as a tyrant, but as a monarch offering dignity to a condemned queen. But what dignity was left to Anne now? In her final days, the ritual of humiliation unfolded like a grim ballet. Her household was stripped away, her personal chaplain replaced. The women assigned to attend her were selected not for loyalty, but for silence. They reported everything she said, from her prayers to her dreams. One day, she laughed in her sleep. The next morning, rumors swirled that she had gone mad. And refused to break. She spoke kindly to her jailers. She took the sacrament. She wrote letters heart-wrenching pleas not for pardon, but for clarity. In one, she addressed Henry as my most dear lord, my most dear king, asking only that he consider their daughter, Elizabeth. There was no reply. Then came the final preparations, and was informed of the executioner's arrival. She asked if he was experienced. They told her he was the best. She nodded. I shall be quite ready, she said. But as the day approached, her composure faltered. She practiced laying her neck on the block. She asked her ladies how to stand, what to say, how to die with grace. On May 18th, the eve of her execution, Archbishop Cranmer came to her cell. The man who had crowned her queen now presented annulment papers in a few strokes of ink. Her marriage to Henry was declared invalid. She had never been queen. Elizabeth was now officially illegitimate, and signed without protest. The ink on the page was wetter than her eyes. She had no more tears left to give. That night, she received the sacrament once more. She slept little. Outside, workmen erected the scaffold on Tower Green inside the fortress walls, away from the common crowds, but visible to the elite. A small stage for a queen's final scene. Torches flickered in the distance. The wood was tested. The block polished. And rose at dawn, dressed in a dark gray gown, her French hood pinned precisely. She looked like a bride walking toward a ceremony no one would survive. The men awaited her, nobles, clergy, guards. But it was the silence that struck hardest. Not a cry, not a protest. Just eyes that would not meet hers, and walked with her. Back straight, her steps deliberate. Her hands trembled only once when she handed her prayer book to her lady-in-waiting. She climbed the scaffold alone, but before she knelt, before the blade was raised, she turned to the crowd and spoke. Her voice did not shake, and what she said would haunt England long after her head had fallen. And Boleyn stood upon the scaffold as the morning sun filtered weakly through the clouds above Tower Green, a place where grass still grew despite the blood it had swallowed. The small platform had been freshly sanded, its planks damp with morning dew. At its center stood the low block, though she would not use it in the traditional way. The executioner had brought his sword, not an axe, and for this, she would remain standing, kneeling upright without resting her neck. She looked out at the select audience. No commoners had been permitted entry. Instead, a handful of lords, ladies, and officers stood in solemn rows, pretending this was justice. Among them were men who had once knelt to her, once toasted to her health and Elizabeth's birth. Now they stood as silent stone, their eyes downcast or fixed blankly ahead, as if too much humanity would betray them, and cleared her throat and began to speak. Her voice, impossibly steady, rang out over the hushed courtyard. I am come hither to die, she said, according to law, and by the law I am judged to die. I pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you, for a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never. It was a lie, every listener knew it, and knew the game. A true accusation would only ensure her daughter's ruin. And so, in her final moments, she protected Elizabeth with a performance more powerful than any rebellion. She knelt, straight-backed, hands folded, Her ladies removed her hood and bound her hair so the blade would meet no resistance. She repeated, a prayer under her breath, lips moving without pause. The executioner, imported from Calais, stepped forward quietly. He was dressed not in black but in plain garments, holding a finely sharpened sword rather than the clumsy axe of English custom. He had rehearsed this moment countless times. His job was not only to kill but to make death look clean illusion of mercy. But first, he whispered to his assistant, bring me the sword, and took a single step back, and turned her head slightly, unsure whether the blade had been brought forward. It hadn't. It was a trick, a moment's misdirection designed to ensure she wouldn't flinch. And then, without a sound, without warning, the blade flashed in. The air clean, silver, final, and head fell, landing inches from her body. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Blood spilled onto the boards. Her ladies screamed, but caught her body before it collapsed entirely. They wrapped it in linen, as Anne had requested, and gathered her severed head, cradling it like a broken relic. There were no drums, no proclamations, just wind and horror. The body of England's former queen was placed in an arrow chest too small for royalty, unfit even for a commoner. No tomb had been prepared, no monument awaited. She was buried hastily in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, beneath the stones where future feet would tread in ignorance. Henry was not present. He had never intended to be. Instead, he spent the morning preparing for his next wedding. Jane Seymour would become queen less than 2 weeks later, and so the blade did not just sever a head, it severed an era. With Anne's death, the great gamble of the English Reformation claimed its most intimate casualty. But even then, it wasn't the blood on the scaffold that haunted England. It was the silence that followed, because although her body was buried, and Boleyn's shadow refused to stay dead, and what it would haunt next was not the court, but the king himself. There had been no flames, but the sensation of burning lingered in the eyes of the onlookers, in the hearts of those who had once whispered her name with reverence. The select few who had been summoned to witness and Boleyn's death did not leave with satisfaction. They left with silence stitched across their lips and something colder than fear clinging to their ribs, shame. Even those who despised her could not unsee what they had watched. A queen kneeling without flinching, a sword slicing through flesh with surgical finality. The sudden collapse of everything regal into something human and bleeding, and the blood so vivid, so red, spattered across the pristine planks of tower. Green refused to be ignored. It soaked into the ground like memory itself. Among the nobility, conversations grew guarded, jests about and disappeared. Toasts to the new Queen Jane Seymour felt rehearsed and hollow. A strange unease rippled through court, not spoken aloud, but reflected in how slowly people walked past the tower, in how clergy stumbled over her name in sermons, in how some could no longer look at Elizabeth without remembering her mother's eyes. Even the executioner, known for his precision and poise, left London the next day without ceremony. Witnesses said he avoided the sight of the scaffold on his way out, as if fearing it would follow him. Others who had been present reported sleepless nights, nausea, and a heaviness that no feast or prayer could shake. But nowhere was the disturbance more evident than in the man who had ordered it all. Henry VIII did not attend the execution, but he felt its weight in full. That very afternoon, he rode to Jane Seymour's residence at Wolf Hall. To those who saw him, he looked jubilant, but those closest to him reported something else, a wildness in his laughter, a refusal to mention Anne at all, even as her blood cooled on the scaffold. Within days, he made plans to marry Jane. The wedding was performed with swift precision, no mourning period observed, no royal pause to reflect. But the speed only amplified the discomfort. Anne had been queen just weeks before. Now, her death was being erased, rewritten as necessary, inevitable, even righteous. But memory does not obey monarchs. In foreign courts, Anne's death caused ripples of horror. The Holy Roman Emperor's ambassadors described it as barbaric. French nobles, once allies of Henry, whispered warnings about the danger of aligning with a king who could murder his wife and mother of his heir. Rome, though still estranged from Henry, expressed quiet satisfaction that the woman who had broken the church's grip had met a grisly end, yet even they recoiled at the method. Back in England, Tower staff spoke in hushed tones. The woman whose remains had been buried without ceremony now seemed to haunt the chapel. Where she lay, her ghost was not the wailing kind, but the unspoken one, the kind that lived in glances, in guarded words, in the weight of unfinished prayers, and, above it all, her daughter Elizabeth, barely 3 years old, remained at court, too young to understand the loss, to watch, to ask the wrong questions. But those who saw her noticed something uncanny. She stood with a poise uncommon in children. Her presence unnerved courtiers, especially those who had watched her mother die. They would not say it aloud, but many believed that whatever Anne had left behind, it was not buried with her body, because power, once touched, leaves an echo, and Anne Boleyn's echo had just begun to speak. What followed would be the unraveling of a king and the rise of something he could never destroy. Anne Boleyn's body was gone, but her presence lingered like a bruise beneath the skin of Henry's court. The king had married Jane Seymour 11 days after the execution, but no one was fooled by the haste. The ceremony was polished, the smiles forced, the throne reoccupied, but the space Anne once filled refused to vanish. She had become an absence that could not be filled. For the first few weeks, Henry appeared content. He rode, hunted, and paraded Jane as the new model of virtue. She was everything and had not been modest, obedient, silent. Yet those closest to Henry saw the cracks forming. He grew irritable over trivial matters, lashed out at servants, and ordered musicians to stop playing certain songs' melodies. Once composed at Anne's request, her name was never mentioned, but her shadow was everywhere. The king's health declined. His ulcerated leg worsened. His appetite swelled. He began to isolate himself, speaking only to a few trusted courtiers. Those who tried to celebrate his new queen too loudly were met with cold stares. He did not want reminders of Anne, but the effort to forget her only deepened her ghost's hold on his mind. One night, Henry was said to have awakened screaming. His guards found him pacing, muttering about betrayal, about blood on his hands, about a woman with dark eyes who would not look away. These rumors reached the ears of diplomats, and foreign observers began to sense something unraveling. The mighty king who had defied the Pope now seemed haunted by the corpse he had created. Meanwhile, England wrestled with the consequences of Anne's fall. Reformists lost their champion. The Protestant factions she had nurtured now lived in fear, unsure how far Henry would retreat to please his new, more conservative queen. The religious shift she had ignited flickered, sputtering beneath the pressure of uncertainty. But the most profound legacy Anne left behind was not political, it was living. Elizabeth, the daughter she died protecting, had been declared illegitimate, her rank stripped, her future uncertain. But even at a young age, she bore herself with a presence that unsettled those around her. Observers wrote of her intelligence, her composure, her piercing gaze. She was her mother's child, and that terrified the court, because Anne's execution had not killed the idea of her. If anything, it had immortalized it. She had become a symbol of dangerous ambition, of royal wrath, of the limits of female power, but also, unknowingly, of something deeper, resistance, among the common people. Stories began to circulate. Ballads were whispered, not sung, about the beautiful queen who died innocent. Some said her ghost walked near the chapel at night. Others believed her soul had entered Elizabeth, guiding the girl's destiny. Superstition clung to Anne's name, twisting her into myth even as the crown tried to erase her. For Henry, the burden became unbearable. Though he never voiced regret, he began to speak of order, of divine right, of how traitors must be punished and prompted, unprovoked. His justifications revealed more than any confession, and those who once orchestrated Anne's fall, like Cromwell, would eventually feel the king's wrath themselves. The axe, once raised for her, would swing again and again and again. But it was not revenge that gave in her final triumph. It was the survival of her truth. The world had tried to unmake her, to turn her into a footnote or a warning. But instead, her story had become a mirror, reflecting everything corrupt and terrified in the men who killed her. And that mirror would soon be held in the hands of the very daughter they had tried to erase. And Boleyn was executed on May 19th, 1536. Her body lay beneath the stone floor of St. Peter ad Vincula, marked only by silence. No grand tomb, no royal epitaph. She had been removed from history by those who believed they were cleansing it. Yet history has never obeyed the will of kings, and Anne's legacy proved impossible to bury. For decades, her name went unspoken in public halls. Courtiers avoided mention of her to Henry's face, lest they trigger one of his violent moods. Even in private letters, she was referred to only as the late queen or the woman. But whispers persisted, passed in corners and across borders. Ambassadors in foreign courts continued to exchange theories about her downfall. In France, poets penned verses to her memory. In Germany, Protestant scholars lamented her death as a blow to Reform. And in England, she lived on in her daughter. Elizabeth Tudor, the child declared illegitimate by her own father, grew under the long shadow of her mother's execution. She was sharp, observant, and unusually composed. She watched as her half-brother Edward became king, then died young. She witnessed her sister Mary rise to power, burning Protestants in the name of faith. Through it all, Elizabeth remained silent, calculating, waiting. And when her time came, she did not merely inherit the throne, she reshaped it. In 1558, Elizabeth I became Queen of England. The daughter of the executed queen now wore the crown that had cost her mother her life. Her ascension was not just a political event, it was a resurrection. With every royal decree she signed, with every enemy she defied, Elizabeth carried Anne's ghost beside her. It was not the legacy of scandal that defined her reign, it was the strength to survive it. Anne had been punished for her ambition, for speaking boldly, for daring to challenge the quiet submissiveness expected of queens. Yet those very traits, intelligence, confidence, unyielding will, were the foundation of her daughter's rule. Elizabeth turned what had once been a death sentence into a legacy of endurance. Under Elizabeth, England flourished, the arts bloomed, exploration expanded, the threat of invasion was repelled. But within the glittering achievements of the Elizabethan era was a quieter victory. Anne's redemption, no longer whispered about in fear or scorn, and Boleyn began to re-emerge in the English consciousness. Chroniclers wrote cautiously at first, then more boldly. Paintings were preserved. Her name was spoken with a different tone. Still, the weight of her death never fully lifted. Her story became a cautionary tale, not just of power abused, but of a society that could not accept a woman who did not kneel. Historians would argue over her guilt or innocence, her ambitions or arrogance, but what remained undeniable was the brutality of her end and the dignity with which she met it. The scaffold at Tower Green stood long after her execution. Visitors often lingered there, some unaware of the spot's significance, others drawn by an inexplicable gravity. Flowers appeared at the site, year after year, some anonymous, others from descendants, admirers, or those who saw in and a reflection of the fight for agency and truth. Over time, the woman who had been painted as a witch, a seductress, a traitor became something else entirely, a symbol, not of perfection, but of resistance. A woman who paid the price for daring to speak, to act, to live fully in a world built to silence her. And in the end, Henry's effort to destroy Anne Boleyn achieved the opposite. He killed her body, but not her name. He silenced her voice, but not her story. He tried to erase her, and instead, he ensured she would never be forgotten. Because when Elizabeth ruled, it was not only the daughter on the throne, it was the legacy of the mother. A legacy born in love, broken by betrayal, buried in stone, and yet still rising. And that is the horror Henry never anticipated. Not that Anne Boleyn died, but that she outlived him.